Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In today's video, I want to talk to you about a subject. A lot of students ask me, and folks just in general like to know what's called the glycemic index, or know about it, or at least to understand if it's even useful or helpful. I do like to teach it normally in a personal training course. Anytime I'm teaching anything on nutrition, it's always a good idea to kind of go over and understand a little bit about the glycemic index. There's also another measuring tool that is used known as the glycemic load. I'll talk about that in another video. But today I just want to give you a little bit of information on the glycemic index and kind of how it's used, and for the most part, how it's not used in personal training. And you got to keep in mind that we try to keep things as simple as possible when we're dealing with clients. Now, also got to make a distinction here. The average client that you're dealing with, for the most part, has more issues that they need to be concerned about than necessarily just the glycemic index of a particular food. Now, if you are dealing with clients that are clinically diagnosed with diabetes, then they should obviously be under the care of their physician. They would be given nutritional advice, nutritional planning, generally by a registered dietitian. That is not what we are dealing with here, although, ironically enough, most of what we know and understand and research collected on the glycemic index, a lot of that, particularly today, comes from research into obesity and diabetes as well. So it's kind of important that we have that information. But first off, what is the glycemic index, right? Glycemic itself simply refers to sugar, or in this case, blood sugar. And so what we have to always keep in mind that when we're talking about glycemic index, glycemic load, the glycemic impact, anything related to blood sugar, the elevation, the rise of blood sugar after eating food, after eating a meal, the suppression of blood sugar due to hormones, right, such as insulin, and the elevation of blood glucose due to the hormone glucagon, right? So these are the sort of the concepts that help us to understand the glycemic index. So glycemic index, sugar, blood sugar, and in this case, the sugar we're talking about is glucose. Now, you know, there are more sugars than just glucose. Some sugars have a greater, quote, glycemic impact. Okay, so glucose, dextrose, these sugars have a fair impact on your blood sugar levels, whether they rise or fall. One sugar in particular, fructose, has little to no impact on the elevation of blood sugar levels, but that is another entire subject. Fructose, we kind of have a love-hate relationship with it because it impacts blood lipid profile, particularly triglycerides. But the point is that the glycemic index is a measure of glucose, right? So the blood sugar that we deal with on a daily basis is glucose. So the glycemic index is simply a measure of the impact that a food that you eat, any food, you name it, piece of bread, beans, rice, any food that generally contains, got to contain carbohydrates that can convert into glucose in your body, metabolize ultimately into glucose in your body, will have a number associated with it on what's known as the glycemic index table. So the glycemic index is simply a measure of the impact of food that you eat has on the elevation of blood sugar. It's generally the clinical testing that is done is usually they'll take 10 people. This is the sort of the research, how the research parameters pan out. You take 10 people, you fast them for 12 hours, and whatever your target food is, whatever your research food is, let's just say a company wants to do the glycemic index and come up with a number for, I don't know, they're a bakery company, so they have a roll, right? A white bread or wheat roll, something like that. And they want to know, and they want to get the impact of the glycemic index on that particular product. They send it over to a research lab. Research gets 10 non-diabetic, right, individuals, and 10 of them generally, I think, is the research protocol that's used. So they'll take 10 individuals and they'll fasted, right? Fasted. So generally an empty stomach, they give them the food, and then they start taking periodic blood samples and testing the blood sugar for about 2 hours, right? I think 2 hours is the protocol that's normally used. And then they have what's known as an area under the curve. They get those numbers. And by the way, they're going to take all those 10 data points and they're going to average them out. Now, they do that. And then at some other point in time, they're going to do the same protocol, 12-hour fast, same 10 people, and they're going to give them generally a glucose, liquid glucose solution, like 50 grams. I've seen research studies with that where they use 25 grams, but the general protocol is 50 grams of glucose, drink it down, and they do the same thing. So they're taking blood and they're checking over a period of time under 2 hours, and they find out what the quote AUC or area under the curve is. And those values are compared. Glucose is the standard that is used. It is given an arbitrary number of 100. That's why in a glycemic index table, any table you look at or any food, you'll notice it has a number designated between 0 and 100, right? So glucose itself, when you drink glucose, its impact on blood sugar after 2 hours is boom, this much, right? So you'll have a blood sugar increase to a certain level, and they mark that off, and that becomes the standard that is 100. Every other food that you consume in general is probably going to have a number lower than 100, which basically indicates that that particular food will convert into glucose ultimately slower than pure glucose, right? So it takes a little bit of time after you drink a glucose solution for it to go into your stomach, get busted down by some enzymes, goes quickly into the small intestines, and then within a reasonable period of time, that glucose that continues through into the small intestines will get absorbed into the blood system, and it can be registered on blood work. So that's how it works. So glucose 100. Every other food that contains carbohydrates and some level will have a number lower than that, which indicates that the glycemic response is slower. So glucose, your blood sugar level rises. Other foods don't rise as much. Now, this is very important when it comes to processed foods versus unprocessed foods. And that's why the glycemic index can be very helpful even for the average client. It's one of the ways that I've always been able to very quickly explain why you don't want to be consuming generally processed foods. Why? Because processing foods in general, particularly carbohydrate foods, removes some very important nutrients from the food. Forget the vitamins and minerals that are getting trashed from processed foods in general, but it's also the removal of fibers, particularly soluble fiber, which will actually slow down the overall what we call glycemic excursion of glucose into the from the stomach into the small intestines and then into the blood system. So this rate of glucose into the blood system will be slowed down or suppressed, and this is generally considered to be good. And so processed foods generally are going to allow for a faster response. Why? Because if you remove fiber, if you don't have enough protein, if you don't have any protein or fats in the particular foods that you're eating with the carbohydrates, the glycemic response will be faster. And so therefore, a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein with your potatoes, right? With your pasta, with your rice, right? Some fiber in there as well. Generally, soluble fiber is the go-to. Not that insoluble fiber doesn't slow the process down. It's just that soluble fiber, because of its increased viscosity, right? That it actually increases sort of the thickness, the viscosity of the chyme that's actually moving into your small intestines and moves through, slows down the excursion of glucose into the blood system. Why? Because the enzymes that break down these polysaccharides, right, in general, and breaks down the starches, they can't attack the food and the starches and the polysaccharides as easily. And so this viscous nature of soluble fiber actually slows down and lowers the glycemic index. So again, glycemic index, just an indication, take a food. I mean, for simplicity purposes, I eat the food, right? And after about 2 hours, once I take a measurement of the glycemic impact or the amount of blood sugar that's been released into my blood system, has a certain speed associated to it. If it's generally slower than pure glucose, it's going to have a number lower than 100. The lower that number, the slower that particular food item is going to convert into glucose in my blood system. That's how this works. It's that simple. So do not make the assumption, though, that all foods that are lower on the glycemic index are healthier. See, the glycemic index is not about whether a food is healthy or unhealthy, whatever that means. It's just a matter of the speed at which glucose shows up in your blood system after you eat the food. Now, just keep in mind, one of the reasons it's a problem if it goes into your blood system faster is because if your insulin response, and this is where when I'm talking to a client, the reason I want their in general, their food or glycemic response to be lower, right, or lower a glycemic index is because we don't want this high insulin response due to the foods they're eating, because that has its own issues associated with it. Again, another video on insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, and insulin response to the food you eat. In general, the way I would normally explain it to a client, and this is how you can use it, is that the glycemic index of any particular food, right, should be on the lower end, right? So generally below 55. And you can look that up on any food, by the way. You can Google it and put glycemic index, and it'll tell you on average what the majority of all the research studies that have been done on that particular food come up as. Now, another thing to keep in mind about glycemic index is that even though you have a particular food, let's say you have a potato. Okay, I'll use my mouse as a potato. Classic example of how glycemic index can actually be different because of a number of variables. Number one, the food itself, right? Just the food itself has a certain glycemic index. Take a potato, just a regular old raw potato. You haven't even cooked it. I'm not saying you eat a raw potato, but if you just take that potato, right, it would have a certain glycemic index associated with it if you ate it raw. But now I cook it. But it's the way you cook it that can also affect its glycemic index. So that's one variable, right? One of the other we just spoke about is the amount of fat or the amount of proteins and soluble fiber in that particular food. So the more fiber, protein, fat in a carbohydrate containing food like a potato, the lower the glycemic index. But you can also cook it a certain way. Boiling a potato actually hydrates the starch molecules and makes them less capable to be acted upon by the enzymes that break down the starches into the polysaccharides and smaller molecules. So when you boil a potato, it has a lower glycemic index than if you were to bake a potato. So think about it. Baking a potato dehydrates it, makes it easier to, quote, convert into sugar in your digestive system. Boiling a potato hydrates the potato, actually does a number of different things to the molecules, starch molecules. And by the way, if you cool it after you've boiled it, you will create what are known as resistant starches, which themselves are almost impossible for the enzymes that convert your starches into sugars. Makes it almost impossible for them to digest and break it down into glucose, which is actually pretty good. So boiled potatoes, whoosh, lower on a glycemic index. Baked potatoes, higher. Well, what about the way you cook them? Or what about the level of acidity of the food? For instance, a potato that has vinegar and other acidic liquids associated with it will actually lower the glycemic index. See how this pans out? It could get complicated unless you tell folks just to kind of keep in mind. Stay away from processing foods, which generally removes the soluble fibers to a certain extent, might extract the proteins, and then the food product becomes what it is. Potatoes, again, are a great example of this. So you want to keep the fiber in the food, in the carbohydrate food, little bit of fat in the meal, some proteins for sure in the meal. All of that will ensure that the carbohydrate you're consuming will have a lower glycemic index. But also keep in mind, just because it's a low glycemic index doesn't mean it's always healthy, right? Cake, pastries, in some cases that contain a lot of fat, and they're not good, obviously, because of the type of flour that's being used and added sugars that are in it. But believe it or not, these pastries, for instance, that contain high levels of fat lower the glycemic index. So you can actually consume too much fat with your carbohydrate, and that will lower the glycemic index. Doesn't mean it's healthy. On the end, look to the other side of this. Many fruits, really good, healthy fruits, watermelon is our sort of go-to poster child for this, is pretty high on the glycemic index. But the total amount of sugars contained in any amount of watermelon is so low, it's almost irrelevant as to the negative effect of the sugars in the watermelon, right? Because this takes us to the glycemic load concept. So the idea that a watermelon, because it's high on the glycemic index, is unhealthy doesn't make any sense, right? So go ahead and enjoy the watermelon, and it's got a couple of minerals and vitamins in there that are also beneficial. So just because it's high on the glycemic index doesn't mean it's unhealthy. If it's low on the glycemic index, doesn't mean that it's healthy. That is not the case. Now, again, it goes back to what I said originally, which is the basic level of processing that is being applied to that food product. That is the glycemic index. If this made sense, type the word understood, understand, in the comment section below. If you want more information on how to become a certified personal fitness trainer, go ahead and click on the link in the description box below. Let us know how we can help you out, and have a great weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye.